Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I want to thank my wonderful audience, the member from Central Okanagan, Similkameen, and Nicola for his thunderous applause. And I will start by saying that it gives me great pleasure to stand today to speak on this subject. And I will say at the onset, Mr. Speaker, that you don't get a body like this by not drinking beer. You get a body like this by drinking a lot of beer. So I am in support of freeing the beer. But in all seriousness, Mr. Speaker, I know the honourable member was speaking about this, and it's his motion that we're presenting today, but I will say that it quite disturbed me this morning to hear the Minister of Innovation, Science and Economic Development and his answers to the issues that the member from Central Okanagan, Similkameen and Nicola brought up. And, you know, what is becoming a disturbing trend, I was elected as a new member of Parliament in an opposition role, Mr. Speaker, and as a new MP not part of the previous government. I didn't come to this House for history lessons on a daily basis about what the past governments or governments did or did not do, Mr. Speaker. We came to Ottawa, I came to Ottawa to hold the government to account on what they are not doing and not what previous governments did not do. And what we're seeing the government not doing is provide leadership on a lot of issues, Mr. Speaker. And the government, in fact, the Liberals, in fact, are looking back through rose-colored glasses through a Liberal lens. And, of course, it's easy to govern when you don't want to make a decision. Leadership means that you stand for what's right, even when people don't agree with you. It's about moving people in a direction in which they know they should be going, but perhaps are unwilling to go, and we're not seeing that. And we're seeing a lot of misses here by the Liberal government with respect to the Carter decision and the deadline on June 6th, the agreement on internal trade. And I anxiously await, and I'm sure all Canadians do, Mr. Speaker, for the time when this government starts building their own legacy rather than tearing down others. And I'm not sure and I'm not confident that that legacy will be had. But what we've seen, Mr. Speaker, is a systematic dismantling of a lot of things, almost in effect like governments had never existed in this country, to what the Liberals are doing. I'm not only talking, you know, one of the things that the Liberals need to focus on, Mr. Speaker, is not only talking about the Constitution when it suits them, but the Liberals are the government now, Mr. Speaker, newsflash, and as such, they must uphold the Constitution at all times and not when the wind blows in their favor. So I want to remind Canadians again, Mr. Speaker, how we got to this point. The Como ruling is a landmark court decision in New Brunswick which struck down the province's alcohol importation limits. In his decision, Judge Ronald LeBlanc dismissed charges against Gerard Como under New Brunswick's Liquor Control Act, saying the law violated Section 121 of the Constitution. Section 121 is clear, Mr. Speaker. All articles of the growth, produce, and manufacture of any one of the provinces shall, from and after the Union, be admitted free into each of the other's provinces. Now, in a May 30th news release, our Deputy Leader of the Opposition and the member from Okanagan, Similkameen, Nicola, issued a press release, and it said, if the Liberal government truly supports free trade in Canada, it will refer the Como ruling to the Supreme Court and agree to act as an intervener now that the Como ruling has been appealed. Given the failure of the Liberal government to reach a new agreement on interprovincial trade with the provinces and territories, it only makes sense for the Liberals to refer the Como ruling to the Supreme Court. The court should also comment on which products, jurisdictions, and types of barriers are covered by the Como ruling. The Como ruling could lead to stronger economic growth because freer trade amongst the provinces and territories is a cost-effective way to encourage greater job creation and private sector investment. A positive decision by the Supreme Court, Mr. Speaker, would also give consumers access to more choice in the marketplace. And they went on to say, it's time to free the beer and free the Canadian economy. So what does it mean? What does it mean, Mr. Speaker, in terms of the Canadian economy? when we look at the issue of interprovincial trade. Now, the Canadian Federation of Independent Business has said, Mr. Speaker, that barriers to internal trade cost the Canadian economy nearly $15 billion every year. $15 billion every year. So what would we, or what could we do with that $15 billion today? Well, $15 billion would pay for a year's worth of taxpayer-funded benefits to parents with children under 18. $15 billion could cover the cost of the employment insurance system for an entire year. $15 billion represents more than triple the funding the government has allocated to building stronger communities in Budget 2016. And Mr. Speaker, $15 billion could even pay for the Liberals' Syrian refugee plan 15 times over, although we should probably wait for the final bill to come in for that before we start committing to that figure. The Atlantic region of the Canadian Federation of Independent Business says that small businesses in Atlantic Canada lose $1 billion in annual compliance costs associated with trade barriers within its region. What can $1 billion do for Atlantic Canada? Well, $1 billion would support the many routes of ferry services in the maritime region for 20 years, Mr. Speaker. And the Conference Board of Canada says that removing internal trade barriers would add $4.8 billion to real GDP and create 78,000 jobs in British Columbia and Alberta alone. The 78,000 jobs that could be created represents more than all of the jobs lost in Alberta in 2015. From 1981 to 2014, interprovincial trade has lagged behind growth in international trade, Mr. Speaker. From 1981 to 2014, interprovincial trade grew at an average annual rate of 4.2%, and international trade grew at approximately 6%. So in terms of the federal angle on interprovincial trade, what does it mean? Now, the Minister of Innovation, Science and Economic Development wants to talk about previous governments. Well, let's talk about previous governments, Mr. Speaker. The previous Conservative government, with the provinces and territories, agreed to work together to increase free trade across provincial borders. Former Industry Minister Mr. Moore declared the agreement on internal trade outdated and made removing domestic barriers to internal trade a priority. The former minister called for the modernization of internal trade in Canada by updating the agreement on internal trade based on 4 new additional principles. And those principles were 1, the economy, and that is that Canadians' goods, services, labor, and investments should be treated as favorably as those from other countries. 2, full, inclusive, transparent coverage, that we should ensure the free trade of all goods and services, labor, and investment. Align or explain. We should work to align regulations, standards, and practices across the country and explain when exceptions are necessary. And accountability. Parties should regularly report to Canadians on the progress of those modernization efforts. And those, in fact, Mr. Speaker, were the goals of the previous Conservative government, understanding that there were limits on internal trade, that the Como case has now constitutionally opened up. And the Senate, in a report, Mr. Speaker, on internal trade called Tear Down These Walls, that was released in June of this year, saw some key recommendations in the report, and I would encourage all members of this House, the report is available, to read the report if possible. And so the current AIT, in conclusion, Mr. Speaker, had a deadline of March 31st for a renewed agreement. No new agreement has been announced, and when the agreement on internal trade was signed in 1994, Canada had free trade with 2 countries, Mexico and the U.S. Today, Canada has 36 agreements involving 15 countries. The federal government, the Liberal government, needs to lead and show leadership as the intervener of the Como case now that it has been appealed. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.